All right, today we're diving into a really fascinating analysis of Jesus as he appears in the Quran. But we're going to look at it from a perspective you might not have considered before, a non-supernatural one. Now, this isn't about challenging anyone's faith, not at all. Instead, what we're going to do, based on the sources for this explainer, is use the Quran's own internal rules to understand its logic from the inside out. So the first thing our sources point to is this massive recurring idea you see all over the Quran, that God's way, what's called sunnatullah, is essentially the laws of nature. And these laws are fixed. They are unchanging. Think of it as the fundamental operating system of the universe. It's presented as a foundational rule that everything else is built upon.
But, and this is a pretty big but, this creates an immediate tension because the Quran also describes Jesus performing what we've all come to know as miracles. You know, things that seem to be straight-up violations of those very same unchanging laws of nature.
And that right there is the central puzzle our sources try to solve. It's a real head-scratcher. How can these two seemingly contradictory ideas live side by side in the same text? Well, the answer, they argue, isn't some external explanation. It's found by using the Quran's own interpretive keys. Okay, so key number one is the word for miracle itself. The Quran doesn't really have a word for a supernatural event that breaks the rules of physics. Instead, it uses the word ayah, and an ayah means a sign. A sign isn't the event itself, it's something that points to a deeper reality. You know, like a signpost on a highway? It isn't the destination, it just shows you the way. Key number two takes us right back to that foundational rule we started with. That principle of unchanging natural laws, sunnatullah, is described in the text as muhkam. And that's a huge deal. It means it's clear, it's precise, it's foundational. It's like the anchor for the entire ship. You don't just ignore the anchor. And that brings us to the third and final key, a category of verses called mutashabihat. These are the allegorical or metaphorical passages, the ones with multiple layers of meaning. And here's the kicker. The Quran itself gives us the instruction manual in verse 3:7, saying that these allegorical verses must be understood through the lens of the clear foundational ones. So you see the method here? When you come across an allegorical sign, an ayah, that seems to contradict a foundational principle, you're supposed to interpret it in a way that actually aligns with that principle. The allegorical doesn't exist to break the foundational rule, it exists to illustrate it. Before we apply this to Jesus' miracles, let's look at a quick example of how the Quran uses language like this. Take the word death. Of course, it means biological death, but it's also used all the time as a metaphor for being spiritually unaware or morally lost. Verse 6:122 asks something like, "Is one who was dead and we gave him life?" It's obviously not talking about a zombie. It's talking about someone who was spiritually dead and was then awakened by guidance. Okay, so when we use this interpretive key, the miracles completely transform. They're no longer about breaking physics, they become these powerful signs for what a messenger actually does. Creating a bird from clay, that becomes a metaphor for elevating human beings, made from base clay, to spiritual heights through the breath of guidance. Healing the blind is a sign for restoring intellectual sight to those who can't see the truth. Giving life to the dead is a sign for awakening the morally unconscious. And speaking from the cradle signifies that his message was pure and consistent from the very beginning to the very end of his mission. And here's a really crucial detail. Every single time these acts are mentioned, the Quran adds the phrase, bi-ithni Allah, or by the permission of Allah. Now you might think that means God gave him a special pass to break the rules. But our sources argue it means the opposite. It means he was working within God's established system, using the very laws of guidance and human transformation that God put in place. Now this interpretive lens doesn't just stop with the miracles. It also sheds a whole new light on the unique titles given to Jesus in the Quran. So let's take a look at those next. First up, we have the Ruh, or the Spirit. The sources highlight that the Quran never actually defines the Ruh as a specific winged angel. Instead, the term is used to describe things like the animating spark of consciousness breathed into Adam, or the force that carries God's message, or even the revelation itself. It's more like the energy of divine communication. And this is where it gets really interesting. When the Ruha appears to Mary, the text uses a very specific word, tamathala. It didn't physically become a human, it represented itself in the likeness of one. The word implies a parable, a comprehensible form for her to understand, not a literal physical transformation. It was divine inspiration taking a form she could interact with. Next up is the title Kalima, or word. Now, this isn't just a regular word. In the Quran, it means God's decisive decree, his unchangeable purpose. It's a reality-shaping pronouncement that once it's out there, is set. And Jesus himself is described as a kalima from God, delivered to Mary. So when you put these titles together, they stop being random names and start looking like a coherent, functional profile, almost like a job description. The kalima is the divine purpose or the project. The Ruh is the divine inspiration, the energy that powers that project. And Al-Masayah, whose root means to wipe or survey, is the function itself, the reformer who carries out the purpose by wiping away distortions and reestablishing the truth. So the portrait that emerges from this whole analysis is pretty clear. It's one of a unique but fully human messenger. His miracles are powerful signs that point to his function of spiritual transformation. His life is the embodiment of a divine purpose, powered by divine inspiration, all with the specific mission to reform and purify people's understanding. And finally, the sources bring up one more piece of textual evidence to ground this non-supernatural reading. And frankly, it's a big one. In a passage listing prophets who descend from the line of Noah, the Quran includes Jesus right there in the list. The key here is the specific Arabic word used, dhurriya. This term means progeny or lineage, and it strongly implies biological descent through the father's line. So the question the sources pose is a direct one. For Jesus to be included in this dhurriya, this patrilineal chain, how is that possible without a biological father? It seems to put this verse at odds with the traditional story of a virgin birth. And that leaves us with a final thought to mull over. If an interpretation like this is plausible, if Scripture can be read not as just a history book of supernatural events, but as a consistent and rich map of signs, then the real question becomes, in your own life, what are those signs pointing you towards? That's the reflection this analysis leaves us with.